Good evening to all of you, and thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight at the Institute for the presentation by Professor Quinn Slobodian of his latest book, Hayek's Bastard, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. Dear Quinn, it really is a great pleasure for me to have you tonight. It's a great pleasure for us to have you tonight at the Institute, and thank you very much for making the time on your way to Lausanne, where you have another workshop starting tomorrow. So Professor Quinn Slobodian is currently one of the most original and powerful voices in the history of political thought. I'm sure you all know that. He has significantly contributed in particular to the framing and to our understanding of the global history of neoliberalism. And doing so, he is shedding the light of intellectual and ideological history on the current moment that we are living. Doing so, he is also making it possible for us to follow complex continuities and to identify deep structuring trends in what may otherwise appear as a rather meaningless maelstrom, if we look at it, just on the basis of the news that get to us every day. Quinn is currently Professor of International History at Boston University after having been the Marion Butler McLean Professor of the History of Ideas at Wellesley College. Professor Slobodian is the author or editor of 8 books translated in 10 languages. Everybody in this room certainly knows The Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, which we had a chance to discuss in the afternoon, particularly focusing on the Geneva School and the role that our institute played in that history. This book was published in 2018 and was a winner of the American Historical Association's George Louis Beer Prize. For those among you who are particularly interested by the complex historical trajectories of neoliberalism, you have certainly also read the series of books that were edited with Dieter Pleve and Philippe Mirowski, whether The Road from Mont Pelerin, The Making of the Neoliberal Thought Collective in 2015, and 9 Lives of Neoliberalism that was published in 2020, after a memorable and exceptional workshop at the WZB in Berlin 2016, which is when we first met Quinn. More recently, some of you may have read Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals, and the Dream of a World Without Democracy that came out in 2023. And tonight we will discuss, as I mentioned already, the latest of those 8 books, which just came out a few weeks ago, I think, with a quite provocative and, as always, very powerful title, Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. Professor Slobodian has held fellowships at many universities, from Harvard to the Freie Universität in Berlin. He was a research fellow at Chatham House and is co-director of the History and Political Economy project, which brings together a network of historically minded scholars whose research examines how neoliberalism has been developed, implemented, and contested around the world. Quinn is also a public intellectual, and he takes very seriously the important role of reading the present for a large public from the strong foundations that his historical professionalism makes possible. He frequently writes for the New Statesman, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and is invited also on many podcast platforms. In 2024, Prospect UK named him one of the world's top 25 top thinkers, and in 2025, he was named a Guggenheim Fellow in recognition of his groundbreaking scholarship. Thank you again very much, Quinn. I will now leave you the floor, and after that we will have a conversation. I will start the conversation and discussion, and then obviously we will open up to the room. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to everybody for coming and for that excessively generous introduction. If you want to check out that book, 9 Lives of Neoliberalism, which is also available for free download due to the generous grant of the DFG and the WZB, there is a great article by the director of this graduate institute about the Atlas Network as the neoliberal think tank of all think tanks and how it went global. So today I am, as promised, going to be reading a bit from this book, Hayek's Bastards, which just came out. For those of you who might be a bit startled by the title, I should reassure you that it's not meant entirely pejoratively, that it's kind of homage to this book called Voltaire's Bastards, actually, nice local Geneva reference, that came out in the 1990s and was an inspiration to me. It was written by a guy named John Ralston Saul, a Canadian public intellectual. And his idea was that the idea of rationality and reason had been bastardized in different ways, so you could follow a sort of abstract idea of reason through to things like the industrialization of mass murder in the Second World War, the industrialization of mass murder in the Vietnam War, and figures like Robert McNamara, for him, were Voltaire's bastards. So I was inspired by the way he was able to use individuals and individual thinkers to kind of shed light on broader social, political, technological processes, and was intent to do so in this case as well, and you'll see why. Hayek is the person to whom these people are bastards, illegitimate offspring. There's also a nest egg other Geneva School person who will pop up at one point in the course of this, even though it is quite a bit more American-centric than the globalist book that some of you may have seen before. Okay, so I'm going to read a bit from the introduction here. The introduction is called Folk Capital. In 2006, Charles Murray, the longtime think tanker and tireless advocate of a revived race science, not least through his New York Times bestseller, The Bell Curve, gave the keynote address at a Freedom Dinner, marking the 25th anniversary of the international hub for neoliberal think tanks, the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. A member of the Mont Pelerin Society since 2000, Murray used his time to rehearse what could at first sound like a well-worn story of how Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher provided the opportunity for the ideas of Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Milton Friedman to break through, aided by Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institution, and dozens of think tanks around the world that Atlas has fostered. So if you know anything about the intellectual history of neoliberalism, that's probably the storyline you know, right? There's some ideas over here. They get propagated and pushed out by think tanks. They eventually land sympathetic ears with prominent politicians, and then that turns into a kind of a transformation of policy and laws. But Murray was actually just setting up his audience. He wasn't actually delivering that same old story. Rather, Murray projected forward and asked what would they be discussing at a similar meeting of the Atlas Network on its 50th anniversary in 2031. He said it would not be economic liberty, free trade, the genius of the entrepreneur, or any of the other standbys of the neoliberal script. He predicted they would be talking about science. For the last 40 years, Murray said, the battle cry of the left has been equality. Science, he said, would deal the death blow to this demand. The explosive growth of genetic knowledge, he said, means that within a few years, science will definitively demonstrate precisely how it is that women are different than men, blacks from whites, poor from rich, or for that matter, the ways in which the Dutch are different from the Italians. If the enemy at its root was the claim of human equality, science would deliver the coup de grace. The confirmation of ineradicable group differences would leave, as he said, a void in the moral universe of the left. If social policy cannot be built on the premise that group differences must be eliminated, what can it be built on, he asked. A few years later, Murray expanded on his theme at a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in an exotic location, the Galapagos Islands. And a friend of mine always encourages me to imagine Charles Murray stroking an iguana as he gives this part of the lecture. The name of the meeting was Evolution, the Human Sciences, and Liberty. And his talk was titled The Rediscovery of Human Nature and Human Diversity, a process that he claimed was going to happen because of new breakthroughs in genetics. These would induce, as he said, reversions to an age-old understanding about the human animal. This would lead to the reconfirmation of discredited prejudices as scientific truths. So all of those things that we had been taught to think about as, bad legacies of former forms of injustice and oppression will now be rediscovered to be based on true science. Blacks were inferior to whites. Women were inferior to men in all kinds of ways. Throughout the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, he wrote, Physical anthropologists had accepted the concept of race with little dissent. Carlton Kuhn's magnum opus, he said, The Origin of Races, in 1962, provoked no outrage when it appeared. Now, if you know anything about the history of anthropology, you know that's absolutely not true. Carlton Kuhn's 1962 book, The Origin of Races, was actually treated with a lot of controversy and was seen as a pushback against Franz Boas and Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict's new ideas about the social construction of race. But nevertheless, he went on and said that since then, two things had led to the intellectual eclipse of human nature and human diversity in the United States: the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. Political developments had obscured what he saw as the primal origins of difference between not only the races but the sexes. He appealed to the sociobiology and of evolutionary psychology developed at Harvard University by E.O. Wilson, Bob Trivers, and his students Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, the latter two who were in attendance in the Galapagos, and claimed that we are still bearing binary gender differences as an inheritance of the savannah. Murray said, men who could process trajectories in 3 dimensions, the trajectory, say, of a spear thrown at an edible mammal, had a survival advantage. Women did the gathering, those who could distinguish among complex arrays of vegetation, remembering which were the poisonous plants and which the nourishing ones, also had a survival advantage. This is why he claimed elevated 3-dimensional visuospatial skills for men and an elevated ability to remember objects and their relative locations for women show up on the tests of these abilities today. It is think about it, very, very strange thing for a kind of free market intellectual to be spending his time talking about at a gathering like this. And yet, so is the argument of this book, going back to nature became an increasingly common move in the 1990s and 2000s, all the way up to what we used to call the alt-right, and now we just call the right, which show that certain hierarchies are not social constructions, but are actually hardwired into our genes and have only been challenged by insurgent social movements and progressive ideologies, which have to be defeated and pushed back into the margins where they began. Shattering taboos around race and gender differences was important not just to fight the pernicious effects of what Murray called the equality premise, in quotes, but to better recognize and organize patterns of aptitude in a changing economy. So it was about beating the left and destroying the demands for equality, but it was also about figuring out how to better fit people into a more complex economy. So finding people with the better visuospatial skills, the higher IQs, was necessary to better construct a capable population in a time of, let's say, competition with a country like China, when knowledge economies and doing things on screens become ever more important. So this wasn't just about beating the enemy, it was also about fine-tuning the workforce. This book, Hayek's Bastards, argues that the appeal to nature was a central part of the neoliberal solution to a problem that they faced in the decades after the Cold War. This was an era, the 1990s, in which communism was dead, but, as they put it, Leviathan lived on. Public spending continued to expand even as capitalism became the only surviving economic system. Behind this was a political problem. The social movements of the 60s and 70s had injected the poison of civil rights, feminism, affirmative action, and increasingly ecological consciousness into the veins of the body politic. An atmosphere of political correctness and what they called victimology stultified free discourse and nurtured a culture of government dependency and special pleading. Neoliberals needed an antidote. Confounded by persistent demands for the redress of inequality at the expense of efficiency, stability, and order, they turned to nature in matters of race, intelligence, territory, and money as a way to erect a bulwark against the encroaching demands of progressives, and hopefully to roll back social changes to return to a hierarchy of gender, race, and cultural difference that they imagined to be rooted in genetics as well as tradition. Now, neoliberals, and this was something we talked about earlier today in discussion of the Geneva Graduate Institute, had always been concerned, at least since the 1930s, with what they called the extra economic conditions for capitalism's survival. They sometimes also called it the meta market. But there they had usually focused on things like law, religion, and morality. So you needed to create the conditions under which the market could operate. That might mean being attentive to things like, Christian morality. It might mean being attentive to the rules and frameworks within which the market functioned. But in the 1990s, the growing influence of Friedrich Hayek's own ideas of cultural evolution and the mainstream popularity of neuroscience and evolutionary psychology led many thinkers to turn to the harder sciences. Changing demographics, an aging white population matched by an expanding non-white population in industrialized North countries, made some right-wing neoliberals and libertarians rethink the conditions necessary for capitalism. Perhaps some cultures, and even some races, might be predisposed to market success while others were not. Perhaps cultural homogeneity was a precondition for social stability and thus the peaceful conduct of market exchange and the enjoyment of private property. So what you get is this strange thing where economists in the neoliberal tradition start talking about things like cultural homogeneity as decreasing transaction costs. You don't want what I call an ethno-economy because it restores some sense of bonds with the land or because some purity of bloodline is calling to you, but because you see it as more economically efficient and optimal to have people of the same race because you have some built-in levels of trust that then don't have to be substituted by excessive government and regulation. Another way this manifests is in the argument of someone like Thilo Sarrazin in Germany. If anybody remembers the extremely influential and best-selling book, Deutschland schafft sich ab, from a few years ago, this book paved the way for the Alternative for Germany party. And how was he making his case against immigration from Muslim-majority countries? He was saying that people from Muslim-majority countries had, on average, lower IQ, and because they have lower IQ, they have less ability to think in long time horizon. They tend to have more of a propensity for instant gratification. They don't have an attitude towards frugality and thrift, and therefore, it's not some abstract ideas of the Aryan North or Hyperborean tradition that's calling him to reject Muslim-majority people, but this bad social science that sits in his footnotes. So it's resting on a premise of seemingly reputable empirical data, which then allows for precisely the bond with ethno-nationalists of the far right, which leads to, of course, their electoral breakthrough. So this strange bad fellow of why do some ordoliberal economists from Hamburg end up working with guys like Götz Kubitschek, who's out tending his cow in the East German countryside? How does an alliance like that happen? Someone might be into exclusion for reasons of cultural purity, and others might be into it for reasons of this strange hybrid of what I call folk capital, where you sort of collectivize certain kinds of economic traits based on, shoddy and error-filled empirics. This ended up being an issue for people in the 1990s. I said it solved a problem of the 1990s because of, and this is something that really struck me when I was looking at the sources, is that the studies of neoliberalism that we had actually didn't account very well for the time when they had supposedly reached their greatest victory. So the 1990s, we would assume, would be a time when neoliberals would just be out, polishing busts of Mises and Hayek, celebrating the death of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And yet, as I found when I was reading things they were writing in the 1990s, they seemed to fear something very strange. They seemed to fear that the Cold War had actually been lost. Get your head around that. But this is almost immediately, right? So I'll quote you from a gathering of the Mont Pelerin Society, 1991. The Wall Street Journal reported from the gathering. They said, "It's fitting that the Mont Pelerin Society, the world's leading group of free market scholars, was meeting the week that communism collapsed in the Soviet Union. But those gathered saw that as communism exits history's stage, the main threat to liberty may come from a utopian environmental movement that, like socialism, views the welfare of human beings as subordinate to higher values. Communism, in other words, was a chameleon. It had changed shades from red to green, as the term was often used at the time. Having fought back a red tide, said one neoliberal in an early 90s conference, we are now in danger of being engulfed by a green one. The forces that once marched under the banner of economic progressivism have regrouped under a new environmental banner. Interviewed by the journalist and later restrictionist firebrand Peter Brimelow in 1992, Milton Friedman expressed a similar sentiment. Asked about the Cold War's end, he responded, "Look at the reaction in the U.S. to the collapse of the Berlin Wall. There weren't any summit meetings in Washington about how to cut down the size of government. What was there a summit meeting about? How to increase government spending. What was the supposedly right-wing president, Mr. Bush, doing? Presiding over enormous increases in paternalism, the Clean Air Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the so-called Civil Rights Quota Bill." So some people might think that this obsession with things like wokeism or DEI or CRT is some recent manifestation on the right. Not at all. This is exactly what they thought that communism had morphed into at the end of the 1980s and 1990s. It was special interest pleading around questions of race, the environment, women's rights, and eventually, of course, gay and trans rights and disabled rights very early on, actually. "The enemy has mutated," wrote The Economist and Geneva Graduate Institute graduate Victoria Curzon-Price, one of the Mont Pelerin Society's only 3 female presidents. In 1947, she said, "The founders of our society battled with outright communism, planning, and hard Keynesianism. Today, our opponents are more elusive." At the very first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society after the wall fell, held a train ride away in Munich, the president and Italian economist, and later co-founder of Forza Italia with Silvio Berlusconi, Antonio Martino, declared that, quote, "Socialism is dead, statism is not." The 3 biggest threats, he said, were environmentalism, state spending, and European integration. On the first, those in attendance heard that the depletion of the ozone layer could just as well be due to kelp beds, ocean currents, and volcanoes as human activity. And more pressing was the problem of Europe. The supranational institutions that had once promised to be the engines of what Curzon-Price herself once called memorably a Ferrari model of integration, speeding up competition between labor, product, and finance markets, had actually proved out to be a socialist Trojan horse. The parallel, as many saw it, of the unification of Europe at the same time as the Soviet Union was dissolving struck many libertarians as uncanny and frightening. It would be an irony of history, German historian of science Gerhard Raditzky said in Munich, if at the time when the post-socialist countries attempt to de-socialize, to make the transition to freedom, a European superstate should embark on the road to more government and more bureaucracy, to creeping socialism, and hence to less freedom and less growth. So the rising tide of the Thatcherite sort of Euroscepticism in the 1990s also figures into this. What happened to the enemy? It had gone from red, it had changed colors and shapes. Now it was in Brussels. Now it was at the United Nations. Now it was in the new laws protecting the rights of minorities and other protected groups. I want to end my bit here by talking about another strange conclusion that neoliberals had. So if one argument was that the enemy had turned from red to green and had turned to demands for equality that needed to be countered through a bad science that reasserted the natural nature of hierarchy in that supposedly uncontestable way that, as one person in my book says, biology stands like a rock in the road of egalitarian fantasies. Another strange and counterintuitive thought that they had at the end of the Cold War was, what if they actually won? What would they do then? Once again, Charles Murray is the best on this. In 1996, he said, because a radical liberal reform now seems potentially within reach in the United States, so if you kill the last boss of, statism after all this stuff, then neoliberals, he said, need to think about how a liberal state may be expected to deal with the human suffering that persists after new neoliberal policies are in place. So once you cut back the state sufficiently, there will be human suffering, right? I've been thinking about this part a lot in the recent battles in the United States over where the line is on things like Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. Where does the quivering heart of the biopolitical settlement actually sit, that if you cut it, then, the organism begins to react. And we know that it does react as soon as you start talking about Social Security cuts and Medicare cuts. Murray's argument is we need to cut deeper, but what happens then when, people bleed out and actually do start dying in the streets? He said that we needed to think about this in analogy to something that Herbert Spencer had said when he analogized society to a drug addict. The transition from state beneficence to a healthy condition of self-help must be like the transition from an opium-eating life to a normal life, painful but remedial. The paragraph from which Murray took this was brutal in its negative eugenics. What Spencer said in the passage Murray was quoting was, having by unwise institutions brought into existence large numbers who are unadapted to the requirements of social life, and are consequently sources of misery to themselves and others, we cannot repress and gradually diminish this body of relatively worthless people without inflicting much pain. Evil has been done, and the penalty must be paid. So the actual victory of neoliberalism will involve a certain level of, pain, a long-delayed penalty for overreach, for the acts of dependency that have been cultivated and made to be part of the expectations of entire generations of people. The social opium eating of welfare can only act as a delay for inevitable withdrawal and misery. One could hope that the addict would recover. As Murray pointed out, many neoliberals claimed that the last 30 years represent only an aberration, so the period from the 1960s, that had just been an aberration which goes against human nature, and all that is required for health is to stop the poison and let the healing process begin. Yet, as Murray said, those were only hypotheses, and scholars have yet to flesh them out with data. It was precisely, in other words, because they were so close to success that they needed to look with clear eyes at the painful transition out of the world of the social state. Would recovery of the masses be possible? Or, as in Spencer's calculus, was the very existence of the dependent population a problem in need of solution? So this kind of very intense, social Darwinist approach of ranking populations, understanding them as those capable of survival and incapable of survival, and most, helpful and productive within a new resettled social contract, was the space where neoliberals' heads were at in 1990s, not triumphalism, not a sense of victory, not a sense of the battle having been won and it now being over. Rather, it was a question of where do we go now if we've actually done a lot of the work of undoing all of the expectations that people in the 20th century modern industrialized state have come to expect from their own governments? How will we rebuild? What scale? Will these be small communities, large? Who will be let in? Who will be kept out? What will the arrangements be if they're not based on traditional forms of Republican representative government? This is, I think, in ways that I unfortunately didn't want to be as current as they are, really where the conversations are at on the right in the United States right now. The question of going that step further that Friedman saw Bush not going in 1990, slashing parts of the government that many people have come to see as normal and to be expected, whether it's the Department of Education or Energy, or indeed getting to the core entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicaid, arguing about who gets in and who stays out based on both a, quote, racist logic, but also an economistic logic. The invocation of IQ, usually by Trump to disparage his enemies and by Silicon Valley people to praise their partners, is only one of the ways that I think a certain kind of way of economizing identity has become now a lingua franca that is almost not even questioned in the conversations on the right. So there's no way I can summarize everything else that follows, but suffice to say I get into this in some detail about how they return to human nature, how they revive discredited forms of racial science, and how, in particular, they also seek to reground value in the shiny yellow metal of gold in a way that they hope will undo the whole fiat currency system that has dominated the American economy since the 1970s. Many parallels there to crypto, and there are other connections to the tech world that we can also perhaps get into in the Q&A. But maybe I'll leave it at that and just be open to all of your questions.
thank you so much, Quinn, for this. And I'm sure that everybody will want to read the next chapters. I would like to start actually with the first question and to push you a bit on what is really clearly a very good title and very provocative, but maybe a bit misleading in the sense that I would like to ask you whether they are really illegitimate kids, bastards, or whether in fact this was actually structured, deeply structured into the neoliberalism from the start. And what is the common thread really all along is what you mentioned very clearly, the sense of hardwired natural inequalities, that inequalities are hardwired and natural. And this actually, when you look at it, resonates deeply with obviously social Darwinism. You've mentioned Spencer, this is a very clear place where it's coming from, but also classical economic liberalism and Calvinism. So some threads that were all circulating, I would say, in early neoliberal circles. So in all three cases, you have hierarchy and inequalities as justifiable and justified. And the better fitted for social Darwinism, the market winners for economic liberalism, or the elected for Calvinism, should retain the privileges that they legitimately acquire. And those on the losing sides are where they should be. And they should not be helped or only marginally, because it's hateful to see people maybe dying on the street, but only marginally. So again, this framing was already present under different variants in the original MPS groups and even before. And maybe the particular form that this framing takes, from the religious to the attempt at scientific neutralization or extreme scientific neutralization, which goes with the zeitgeist, obviously, today, particularly on the biological dimension, maybe less important than the profound elective affinities and continuities. And there are many examples of that one that I like to give, because we discussed Röpke this afternoon. I was a professor here at the Institute. In 1964, Röpke, after a trip to South Africa, writes a text with this title, South Africa, an attempt at a positive appraisal. I didn't know that text, actually I discovered it. This is a text completely profoundly framed by the most extreme form of social Darwinism, where he goes on to actually, praise the Boers in general and some of their leaders, underscoring their toughness, and I'm quoting here, their strength, their efficiency, their outright superiority. And then he says that basically, and I quote him, this picture actually changed only after the Second World War, and with a speed that allows us to see in alarming form how defenselessly and uncritically the Western world surrendered to the ideological intolerance of a progressivism that was not fastidious in its means of influencing the masses. And I think, the way I read that is essentially the West surrendered to the equality framing. And then he goes on with absolutely no idea of the falsifying and distortion of which they are the victims. Countless people are letting themselves see in South Africa an odium generis humani merely because it must solve an internal political problem unknown to other countries. So total justification, obviously, of this very, racist, social Darwinist society. So, that would be my first question. Aren't you making too much of the discontinuity?
Yeah, I mean, so I deal with that article at Schweizer Monatshefte in Globalists, right? So that's like the core of that chapter on a world of races. And what I argue when I deal with that his position on South Africa's outright, super openly racist apologism for apartheid is that it was actually more of a minority position within the neoliberal community at the time when he was writing that in the 1960s. And it's like not for nothing that he left the Mont Pelerin Society shortly after he wrote that. So it's certainly true that there were through lines of scientific racism, civilizational chauvinism, outright white supremacy in this community of thinkers. But I think that the larger arc of the 20th century, if you want to talk about how the debate about how capitalism should be stabilized unfolded, began right here, I would argue, and began with an attempt to reconstruct global order. So Hayek had a narrative that he worked with, and so did Lionel Robbins and many others, Mises too, that was a scalar narrative, which is that civilization started small, and it was, tribes on the savannah, and then expanded over time. And by the time we reached what they called a great society, it was global. And so we were able to be operating in these exchanges with anonymous market actors who we might not ever meet and might not even like if we did meet them. So you realize what, Hayek referred to as the catallaxy. So this sort of spontaneous order would be happening at the level of the planetary. And this is what Milton Friedman celebrates in his example of the pencil, for example, right? Like this thing is created by people all over the world, and International Division of Labor's genius is that it can tap into talents and resources and mediate them through the price system so that we can all somehow get the most out of this. So there really was a big emphasis on scaling up or creating communities of exchange that were as large as possible to allow for maximal forms of efficiency and value for all. And yet, the big riddle I'm trying to answer in this book in a way is, how did people from that same community end up then doing things like pushing for Brexit, opposing things like the WTO, trying to get out of the European Union? When did neoliberals, who I think and have shown for decades would have seen themselves as globalists, suddenly decide that they needed to ally with nationalists somehow to save capitalism? It's like not actually that obvious right away why they would be doing things like that. And so what I do is I tell the history about how within Hayek's own logic and his own intellectual development, he goes from emphasizing the kind of ecumenical space of the great society or the world economy that can be rebuilt to being more interested in the differences between populations. So in the 60s and 70s, if you read his writing, he becomes very interested in the idea of what he calls cultural evolution. The idea being that populations over time developed internally certain kinds of traits that were more adaptive for capitalism than others. And as they developed those, they were then able to do things like open markets, conquer other populations, colonize other parts of the world. And so you got a kind of iterative process inside of populations that led to the imbalanced, unequal world that we have, in the 20th century. And that was a form of dominance that could only be undone either very slowly or perhaps not at all. So we might actually have to live with the fact that he's saying this stuff in the 1980s, that the Western Christian society has bequeathed a set of traits and virtues on the West that other parts of the world don't have. He actually wasn't saying stuff like that in the 1930s and 40s. He was much more focused on how you can create an institutional framework to bring the whole world in somehow. Instead, he starts talking in defensive terms. And I don't think it's a coincidence, right? The story I tell in Globalists, and here is the story extended in a way, is as those other parts of the world entered the world economy, they started imagining a different version of the world economy. And they started saying, with their national independence or autonomy, what if we organized things in ways that were not in accordance with neoliberal principles? That then became an assault on order that needed to be kept at bay. And the creation of social states and systems of entitlements opened the door, as they saw it, to people from other parts of the world coming in and then corroding and undermining the foundations of, Western capitalist virtue, or what Deirdre McCloskey called the bourgeois virtues. So the decolonization prompt a defensive moment from neoliberals that I write about in Globalists. I would say mass immigration prompted another defensive response from neoliberals, in which they tried to re-essentialize and renaturalize now the ability to even operate within a market system effectively. So Rupke was ahead of his time in that sense, but he was not, I think, he was an indicator species of a kind of rollback to more reactionary cultural positions that these market intellectuals would eventually take. And by the 1990s, they're talking about it. By the 2010s, it's full-blown. So someone like Václav Klaus, who people might have heard of, who was the president of Czechia for a while, very active Mont Pelerin Society member, like Milton Friedman Prize and all this stuff, is now just like arm in arm, shoulder by shoulder with all forms of nativism, cultural conservatism, and populism, because he thinks now this is the line that needs to be held to keep capitalism stable against what they sometimes will openly call like the barbarian hordes who cannot act as responsible capitalist actors. So it's in that, I think, that response to, like I said, changing demographics, changing patterns of immigration, that they transform actually their own intellectual premises in some cases. And the reason I say that there are forms of illegitimacy and legitimacy is that it doesn't all go in one direction. So one of the crazier things for me was reading about how in the 1980s and 1990s, some of these hardline Hayekians at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. are reading Paul Ricoeur, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Michel Foucault. They're getting really into what they call hermeneutics, because they're good Austrians, they're good Hayekians. They actually don't believe that the price has all of the information. They think that value is subjective, and we only use prices as second best options because it's the way that we can actually communicate between the unknowable selves. So if you're interested in that, then maybe you'll start saying, where is meaning actually coming from? Like the text or the reader and stuff like that. And so they're like Hayek's good children, I would say. Like they are open to the ideas of getting away from economism, upsetting, expectations about meaning, whereas others go in the opposite direction. They have a very strong reaction against what they call the groupuscules of hermeneuticians at the Mercatus Institute, and said, like, no, it's rock solid. Here's the evidence. Blacks are stupider than white people. Let's start making policy on that basis. Stop getting subjectivist. Stop saying this is relative.
Thank you. A second question I would like to put is the question of religion and its place in this new, morphing of the thought collective. Yeah. You talked a lot about the science and the scientific, path to justify all those. But could you tell us a bit what is your reading on that, on the role and the place of religion, evangelical in particular, but also Catholics, because those have been also important thread in Atlas in general.
Definitely. So if people are familiar with the history of conservatism in the United States, you might have come across this term fusionism, which is usually the way the American right is described. So from the 1950s on, you get a kind of alliance between people who are primarily interested in, Christian faith, tradition and morality, and then people who are primarily interested in economic freedom and entrepreneurship and capitalist rights. That fusionism is what you see in the pages of the National Review. It's what you see in the speeches of someone like Ronald Reagan, or even up to someone like George W. Bush, that combines, this idea of crusades being necessary, but on the other hand, go out and shop to save the country. So that's the traditional fusion of how the right is seen in the U.S. for good reason. It's been extraordinarily powerful as a combination. I call what I talk about in this book a new fusionism, because instead of doing an alliance with religion, there seemed to be this renewed interest that they observe themselves, and I take the term as a native category, so to speak, that in the 1980s and 90s, rather than referring to tradition or morality, they were trying to say, no, we're not just saying capitalism is good because it's also godly, or like Jesus would have been an entrepreneur, or whatever kind of like stupid things you'd often hear otherwise, but because capitalism is science, and actually, humans believe in private property not because someone told them about it, but because when we were on the savannah, we had a relationship to territory, and we seek out, patches that we can defend, and all these kind of ridiculous just so stories that evolutionary psychology encourages in people. So part of the argument is that the 90s and 2000s is also a time of like middle-brow pop science, which becomes a very important genre that I think encourages people to re-navigate and reorient themselves according to what are seen as the new discoveries of science. So the idea that neuroscience explains everything about our psychology, right? You don't need to go to a therapist. It's nothing that happened to you because of your upbringing. You just need to take a pill because it's just chemistry that needs to be rewired. The Human Genome Project being completed at the end of the 1990s produces this discourse of like, there's a gene for this, there's a gene for that, there's a gene for that. So it's rhetorically, I think, a good way for them to reground their project. And then it shows up now if anyone, follows social media accounts on the right or has the misfortune of studying this stuff for a living. The proliferation of like graphs and charts and like this idea that this isn't, you'll be much more likely to see like a bell curve of IQ than you will to see like, a Sonnenrad like logo or something in the discourse of the right now. There's a desire to scientize the defense of certain kinds of freedoms and stigmatize others. So that doesn't mean, though, that religion has gone away. Far from it. No, I mean, as you point out, especially the Catholic fusion with free market principles, I think, is probably stronger than ever, actually, institutionally. And the way that evangelical belief gets fused to ideas of hyper-individualism in places like Brazil or the prosperity gospel in the United States, in sheer numbers, I would probably, rank that higher than the kind of stuff I'm writing about. I think what I'm interested in is this twist inside of the rather closed group of like neoliberal intellectuals. Like, why was it to them somehow interesting to do it this way now?
I mean, that's really interesting. But if I can push the question, sure. I mean, in a sense, the two are there. But wouldn't that actually lead to frictions, contradictions within this broad thought collective? Because you would think so, because at the same time, this religious, this kind of expansion of the religious dimension is coming with a very anti-science discourse.
Yes and no. I mean, I think one thing that the neoliberals can teach us, if we happen to not be on the right ourselves, is they're very good at knowing to keep a united front against a common enemy and to not make too much about doctrinal differences as long as there is a common front. So, for example, it's the mid-1990s that the Vatican begins to roll out the idea that gender ideology, quote unquote, is a culture of death that encourages, the murder of children and endless gender swapping in ways that will lead to the diode of the human race. And the more Catholic-minded people on the right are happy to pick up that language. Someone like Orban and others will embrace the language of Catholic coded opposition to genderism. But then the scientifically minded people will step in and say, you're right. And furthermore, as we know from the visuospatial evidence that Charles Murray presents us with, gender differences also colors our capacity and actually has a longer cognitive story than just one that's designed to encourage, the rise of godlessness. So I find the two things tend to be dovetailed and complementing each other, practically speaking, more often than they're the site of, contention or difference. And that's one of the useful things of actually looking at these convening zones where people are creating new alliances on the right. So Mont Pelerin Society is fairly well known, but there are newer ones, for example, something called the Property and Freedom Society, which I talk about in the book, which I think is one of these more like online produced formations that are good to be aware of, because I think much of the like startup political party energy and startup political movement energy is happening through the affordances of, hyperconnectivity and especially, YouTube videos. And the Property and Freedom Society, which is a sort of a spin-off of the Mont Pelerin Society, has the weirdest groups of people presenting that you would be like, what are these, why do they have anything to do with each other? There's like a Swiss, tax advisor, and like an Afrikaner nationalist from Orania, and like a German revisionist about the Second World War, and a race scientist from Northern Ireland, and Richard Spencer, and the founder of American Renaissance. And they're all circling around the same problem and talking about it in different ways, in different languages, but they have the common enemy, which is egalitarianism, right? Which is the idea of human equality. And if they can all find different ways into that, then actually builds the block rather than anything else. So the goal is, again, what we can learn in a way is never like doctrinal purity, as much as like also applied effectiveness of a certain interlocked series of similar, if not identical, ideas.
Thank you very much. So now I would like to open to the room. I think we have a mic. Yeah, we have a mic here. So who wants to start here?
One mic in a big room.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Slobodian, for your talk. One of the things that kind of came to my head as you were reading your introduction was this kind of similarity, maybe, that I see with this anecdote that I was told about how during the years leading up to the Iranian Revolution, you had all of these highly educated engineers clinging to this idea of Islamic fundamentalism as a way to apply the same mathematical certainty that they saw in their profession to their quickly changing society, and apply moral and political certainty to that while reinforcing certain hierarchies. And here I see a similarity with all of these highly educated economists clinging onto this idea of race, like this kind of similarly almost antiquated idea and ideology of race. And so then my question is, what is it about race that then makes it seem like such a dark, seductive truth almost, that continues to attract so many, so many educated, university-trained people as a way to answer these very complex social questions about resource distribution, et cetera? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I mean, first on the Iranian Revolution, I thought where you were going to go is another strange bedfellows thing, right? Which is basically Islamic fundamentalists and Maoists. but I wasn't familiar with the idea of engineers embracing Islamic doctrine as wonderful because of its purity. But certainly, I think any successful revolution, kind of to Marie-Laura's last question, functions because it's able to articulate seemingly dissimilar viewpoints and dissimilar interests. On why race, I mean, you're familiar with the history of the United States, right? I mean, there's such a deep river of justifiable anger and, never-ending waves of injustice produced by, the reality of chattel slavery in the Middle Passage in the United States, that I think it takes a lot of willpower for Americans to not think about it all the time. I think that there's a lot of reasons why the Black freedom struggle in the United States has hit against walls of resistance after walls of resistance. And even think about this last phase of it. I mean, we are all around to see what the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement were. We know what they were diluted into by the last year or so, the small tokenism that became the DEI movement. The fact that the MAGA movement was still so angry about even having children's books about Rosa Parks in public school libraries, that they needed to bring out the biggest possible hammer they could find to smash that, tells you something about the volatility of this is, I think, still a fault line of politics that continues to be slightly opened up and then clamped down again. So I think, in cases of post-colonial injustice and post-slavery situations, post-slavery situations in Latin America as well as in the United States, then the attempt to argue history away through appeals to natural hierarchies of race is ever seductive. The one that I didn't talk about that's maybe a bit less often considered is the way that it can also help to explain more economic precariousness on the world stage. So what I mean there is the IQ discourse works in two directions for the American right. For one thing it does is say that black people are inferior and will stay that way, so stop trying to change that. But another thing it does is to actually place East Asians on a pedestal, and by the same logic, and so actually the discourse about China and Japan and Korea on the right is quite interesting and quite fraught, because sometimes the question seems to raise in these discussions about whether or not perhaps, quote unquote, they are just superior, and perhaps that's one needs to either create an alliance or somehow fight with different weapons, because when it comes to things like tech and engineering mentalities, East Asians will always beat whites, and that's, this sounds bizarre, but that's actually something that I do think keeps some people on the right, the white right, up at night. And it also is really inflecting this MAGA moment in odd ways. So I don't know how many people were watching this, but when Vivek Ramaswamy and Musk had this sort of conflict with Steve Bannon and Laura Loomer at the end of last year, many people were saying, aha, here's a real fault line inside of the MAGA coalition. But if you look at what Ramaswamy was saying, it was quite interesting, right? It was this Tiger Mom Asian values discourse, where he was like, Asians actually take care of their kids and they teach them how to work hard and do their homework, and white people have forgotten how to do that, and so we need to get back to this. He was trying to bring Asian values into the MAGA coalition, and for good reason. Then Bannon and Loomer, those white nationalists, were like, what are you doing? This is not permitted. And yet, did it blow up MAGA? No, actually it didn't. And what happened when Trump proposed the gold card, $5 million path to citizenship? If you watch the press conference, he says, what we want to do is create a situation where you get a kid from India, Japan, or China who goes to Harvard, Yale, or Wharton, who finds someone who wants to pay $5 million for their citizenship. They should be allowed to do that. Very interesting crack in the nativist white nationalist coalition, I think, that is totally symptomatic of this re-importing of ideas of racial superiority that are non-white as well as inferiority. And it's just two small data points to back up that this is something that's happening. The Naval Academy famously just purged a bunch of academic monographs, and they got rid of a book that was criticizing the bell curve from 1994, but they kept the bell curve. And when the Smithsonian Museum of American Art was just hit for exhibition that they had on race, the exact language they were hit with was saying, this exhibition denies the biological reality of race. That was the grounds of criticism. So this scientization language is not anymore at all just on the chat forums or on the YouTubes. It's part of the policy of the new administration, the executive orders.
Hi, thanks so much. So I live here in Geneva, but I'm originally from Tennessee. So this really speaks a lot to what I saw growing up, but even what I see now, talking with family, and coming from a family of immigrants as well. But I had a question. It's a bit open, but kind of where, in terms of your research, do you see the different neoliberal factions or groups standing in terms of the use of force and who has the right to use of force? Because on the one hand, as individuals, everyone gets a gun. At the same time, what is force? Forcibly deporting people, or, you don't even have to knock on someone's door anymore. You don't need a warrant to arrest someone, at least in Tennessee anyway, in terms of migration questions. So kind of the ignorance of law or kind of setting it to the side at the end of the day. So yeah, just wanted to know, where do you kind of see it now? And since they were talking a bit about what they see in the future if they win, where do they see their responsibility or role in use of force?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. And it's interesting because I would say for the first several decades of neoliberal thought, it was something that was really kind of argued away or sublimated or not discussed directly. So if you look at the idea of law in Hayek, and I would argue it's extremely important, it's the central form of market creation, market ordering is the practice of law. He will talk about laws as the creation of, that there are referees, there are umpires, it's necessary to have law, rule of law, and yet the actual enforcement of law is not discussed as often, or the difference between what Walter Benjamin called, law preserving violence versus law creating violence. So the way that, the police officer in the act of stopping you from doing something is not just keeping the law, they're actually making the law. So that's, I think, quite obvious to a lot of political theorists. It would have been very obvious to Carl Schmitt, for example, who is someone who the neoliberals were, in sort of a fraught conversation with. But what's interesting about this latest round of thinkers is the mask is off, so to speak. So a language of force and even brutality is now openly endorsed. So Murray Rothbard is a guy who I talk about in this quite a bit, and he was, close to Hayek, was in the Montpellier Society from the 1950s, but was an anarcho-capitalist, so didn't believe you needed a small state or a re-engineered state, but just like no state at all. And by the 1990s, he was trying to figure out how you break through that blockage that Friedman was identifying. Like, what the hell? The Cold War's over, yet we still have Leviathan, we still have all the state spending. What's it going to take to actually break through statism? Same question I would argue that Russ Vought is asking at the Office of Management of the Budget in the United States right now, and in certain ways Musk was asking too with Doge. It's just like, this thing has got to die. How do we actually kill this Leviathan? Well, Rothbard said we need to do it by basically embracing populism and the destructive political energies of the population. So he says what we need to do is unleash the cops and basically crack some heads, put the vagrants and the bums in prison and don't let them out. So the embrace of the disruptive qualities of force and violence, and Murray does this too. We need to get back to Victorian qualities of stigma and punishment and pain, because that's the only way that people ever actually change and learn, is now this, what I would see as like a vulgarization of neoliberal rhetoric, where they don't even feel the need to kind of sublimate or argue it away, but it becomes part of the argument that, the inflicting of pain is, I think, as we do not need to be reminded now with the enforcement of the border and deportation regime, right? The violence is the point, and it becomes part of a sadistic theater that is constituent of the policy. It's not, you can't take it out of it. I mean, my favorite example is like when they were putting people on those giant military planes, that was actually not an efficient way to deport people. And yet, damn, like that looked more impressive if people are marching into the back of a plane. But maybe I'll just say one more quick thing on the immigration question, because that's actually a big part of this book, is there's a kind of cliche version of neoliberals and immigration, which is the belief that they must want open borders because then you can just get labor to go where it wants to be and it can drive down wages and things, and that's good, and like break unions, and that's good. But actually, there's two arguments about immigration that emerge in the neoliberal right in the 90s that I show there. One is get away from birthright citizenship and family reunification policy and so-called chain migration, and get more to like a points-based system along like a Canadian or Japanese model, ideally. And then the other is to think about populations as I described, Sarrazin describes them. So think about a ranking of capacity among potential immigrants. And then what Charles Murray says, even though there can be extraordinary individuals in every population, on average, people from, in the example he used, like Haiti or Latin America, will tend to have lower average IQs than people from other countries. Therefore, we can do a rough and ready immigration policy just based on that rule of thumb alone. And again, I probably, don't need to remind anyone in this room, especially sitting across from the UNHCR, that there's only one group that's being granted asylum in the United States, right? Right now, it's white Afrikaners. So either explicitly or implicitly, this racial ranking of human capital understood as potential immigrant is being carried out.
Thank you really for that fascinating and chilling account. I had not read your books. I realize I have to, and thank you also for digging through so systematically all that toxic stuff and coming out undamaged on the other side to share it with audiences. I think I'm always interested in what can move political movements on the other side, what can progressives learn also from this success, and what I find really interesting, how you were talking about how they're able to work across internal contradictions in this movement, which is something that the left is notoriously bad at, right? I mean, infighting is what the left likes to do the most when you don't get at the real enemies. So, what is that force? Is it because you're just against something, or is it also in a positive vision? And maybe also if you could say one more word, because a lot of the focus has been kind of on the think tanks and the elites, if you could say one more words really also about the grassroots mobilization, which unfortunately also the American right has been extremely good at for decades going at. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Maybe I'll take the second one first. So the origin of this book project, I suppose, was a dissatisfaction with a lot of the mainstream discussion of the so-called rise of the right in 2016-17, right? So we all remember this, that the way Trump was explained in Brexit, even the AfD in some circles, was these are the people who had been left behind by globalization, who were angry, 40 years of wage stagnation, regional inequality, the loss of good-paying union industrial jobs, who had not been heard by either of the two big parties. And so here comes Trump, and strange, vessel for this perhaps, but at least he seems to be speaking to the pain and malcontent and misery that people in many cases were feeling. So I don't think that's a totally incorrect explanation about some of the appeal of figures like Trump or Nigel Farage or, insert whoever you want. But it's very much stuck on what political scientists would call the demand side. And it's about saying, what are the motivations of voters? Why do people come out to vote for this party or that? Why do they go to the protests? Why do they go to the rally? And I am not very well equipped methodologically to answer that question, actually. There's a lot of people who are, political scientists, sociologists, ethnographers. But I am equipped to ask the question about what people call the supply side. So where are the ideas that are being offered to those voters coming from? What is being promised? What's being delivered? And what's being, emphasized during the campaign, let's say, and then abandoned during the practice of government? And there, I think, as soon as you look twice at the supposed agents of history, defending the left behinds of globalization, like immediately it was like, what the hell? No, not at all. Like the Thatcherite hyper-capitalists are leading the Brexit movement. Trump is being advised by a bunch of ghouls from libertarian think tanks to create the biggest tax cut in American history. The AfD is actually doing very little to actually help those voters that they claim to care for. So that was, I think, the first cut for me. This is sort of a way of explaining why I'm avoiding your question of the grassroots, is that this is, I think, the effort is to kind of talk about the ideology a bit more than I think we do, rather than assuming that the ideology is a faithful reflection of the resentment and anger of the supporters. So I think there's a lot of just like bullshitting and lying that happens. I think that the Trump campaign has been very good at saying it's going to do a bunch of things and then not doing any of them at all. But then I do think there are new changes from Trump 1 to Trump 2 that I've talked about in other venues as the 3 C's: COVID, crypto, and cage fighting. That basically, I think that the experience of the pandemic and the measures to contain the pandemic produce starkly different reactions in populations, either increasing trust in states and authorities, deepening a sense of social solidarity, or corroding heavily people's trust in their authorities, that has led more interest in maverick candidates. The crypto thing is way more upfront in the second Trump administration than I could have possibly imagined. The fact that, you know, they drop a Trump meme coin on Inauguration Day, and that now you have the top 10. If you're one of the top 10 people with the most Trump coins in your wallet, you get a one-on-one, face-to-face with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. So, like, there's a good reason now to think that crypto is now a new form of leverage, and not just wealth, but also political affiliation and power. And the cage fighting thing is about basically the incredible rise in recent years, especially since COVID, because they stayed open when other sports were closed down, of Ultimate Fighting Championship, MMA fighting, which even just as a business model is like extremely social Darwinist, right? Like they fight 12 months a year, they have no health care, they have no retirement, they have no union benefits, and one boss owns the whole league. So it's not even like, you know, teams owned by, you know, it's nothing like professional sports and normal team sports where there's actually pretty good unions and, you know, certain salary caps and health protections. Because the UFC is not a sport, and Worldwide Wrestling Entertainment is not a sport, it's not governed by the same things that sports are. And yet now it's more powerful than most sports, just as the way that Linda McMahon, who was the CEO of Worldwide Wrestling, and just to give you an example of how deep the fucking rabbit hole goes in America, she had a bit that she was doing for a while where she would be rolled in a wheelchair on stage into the middle of the ring, comatose. That was the joke. And then Vince McMahon, her husband, her real husband, would stand in front of her while she was comatose and make out with a young wrestler woman. And that would be the joke, because she's, you know, this act of infidelity is happening in front of her. She's the Department of Education secretary right now. She also runs the America First Policy Institute, which is the most important think tank for Trump. So that total scrambling, I think, of entertainment and political affiliation, and this cycle of like BDSM style, I don't know what, like transfers of libidinal energy that's happening in the United States right now, is something that I think has unlocked new forms of political association that I didn't see coming, and that I think we can only speculate on how those things are actually working. Yeah, that's probably enough.
And if I'm not mistaken, her husband now joined the board of Meta. Huh?
Vince McMahon?
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's the head. No, that's Dana
yeah.
White, the head of UFC, is on the board of Meta. That's right.
Meta. Yeah. So, well, maybe we can take a few. Because,
we still have a lot of time.
There's a group over here in the middle. Maybe you can give the mic and then.
Yes, thanks so much. So I took as the premise of your talk that you said there was a political project that had difficulties to sell their project to a wider public, and so it was in their interest to say, well, actually what our political project represents is also fundamental biological order. So our idea of ordering society just kind of mirrors the way that biology is being ordered. And I noticed that you took great pains to point out that the underlying biology is wrong. And I mean, it's a slightly naive way of putting the question, why did you feel obliged to do that? Because I think a self-confident left should say, I don't care, right? The project of the left is not to say we treat people equally because they are equally intelligent. The project of the left is we don't care whether they are equally intelligent. Mm-hmm. We insist on treating them equally. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered if this tendency to feel the need to underpin your political project with biology is not a universal tendency of all political projects. And if you couldn't find, in less bizarre forms, the exact same tendency on the left.
Should I go, or you prefer?
Yeah. Okay.
If that's okay?
Well, maybe, I mean, that's like a very specific question, so maybe it's easier to just answer directly. No, it's a good question, and I think there are two ways that what I'm arguing here could be taken, and I could probably be more clear that I wanted it to be taken one way rather than the other. I think one way would be sort of the way that you understood me, and I think it's perfectly valid the way you did, which is to say that I'm suggesting that, you know, politics and science shouldn't mix or something, or like the moment that you start to use biology or science, that's sort of tainted reference, and like that politics shouldn't be operating in that domain. It's a kind of a category error or something. I would like to propose that we could think about it the other way, maybe more like the way you're saying, which is actually that one of the strengths, I would argue of their way of arguing is that they were willing to draw on science. I feel confident in the specific examples that I was referring to that this is definitely junk science, but arguably all politics is premised on some assumption about human nature. So I would prefer to see this as a call to the left also to be more open about the kind of even biological presuppositions of the kind of arguments they're making. And it doesn't always move in the same direction, right? Like the conclusions of genetic science or evolutionary psychology or even intelligence research are not all equally aimed in the direction of the people that I describe here. Often they're actually aimed in very different ways. And very legitimate psychologists use the category of IQ all the time and don't feel like they're touching a third rail by doing so. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I would say that rather than even the left saying, but we don't care, I think that the left should then have their own robust public scientific discussions in which they are clear about what scientific premises and then they are proposing. And I think that's happening a lot, actually. There's a lot of really good work being done there, although not as much as, this kind of leads into the project I'm going to do next, the era of the kind of Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, great debates with E.O. Wilson, who I mentioned here, where someone like Richard Lewontin openly called himself a dialectical biologist or a Marxist biologist. And it's interesting how few people would call themselves that these days, and I actually kind of wonder why. Like, I mean, there has been, I think, a reneging of the language of science and politics that one of the learnings from COVID for the left, I think, is actually, you know, it was weird that everyone became an epidemiologist because most of us aren't very good epidemiologists, but also kind of great that everyone became an epidemiologist, right? Like, it's actually good that we all think that we can say something about these issues. So I appreciate the provocation, though. I think you're right to realize, to point out that I'm open to that reading.
Yeah, thank you for this conversation. I had a question. I wanted you to maybe speak a bit about the appeal that these ideals described in Hayek's Bastards have on the youth. So young people in the United States, we know it's a demographics that has moved a lot to the right during the past elections, and there are many explanations that link to socioeconomics of disenfranchised youths, but also the more decorative elements of USC, cryptos, Elon Musk, and so on. to me, maybe there's something more that I cannot really pinpoint, so I would like to hear you on this topic. Today, I was looking at a Cardis Yarvin debate on YouTube, and I was so surprised by the amount of people that were commenting positively with libertarian ideals under the video. And the average user of YouTube is probably a bit younger than the average fan of Hayek, so I think that, I would like to understand that a bit better. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would too, but I think this is also where I kind of feel the limits of my own methodology. I mean, I think ethnographies of the internet are extremely important and yet still very elusive, I think, methodologically. Even media and communication scholars still have a hard time figuring out like what people are actually engaging with, why they're engaging with it. So I will say two things only. One, that I probably could have and even should have placed more emphasis on the questions of masculinity than I did in this book. Like, I think a lot of, if we talk about secular trends, the secular trend towards women actually going to university more often than men and getting better grades than men, I think is producing a kind of overreaction on the part of many young men who feel now that they are the victimized and subjugated ones and are being told constantly that they are toxic and they are, macho and all these things. So there's a aggressive reclaiming of that. This is the whole like Andrew Tate manosphere kind of discourse, about which I don't really have anything that original to contribute, except to say that I think it is very important, and I'm glad people are trying to figure it out. On the Curtis Yarvin thing, so that was at Harvard, the Harvard Faculty Club, I think you're referring to, with Daniel Allen, just a week and a half ago, I think. And there were many things I think were questionable about the decision to have that debate, but the thing that really hit me the most is reading a description of it in the New York Times, and it pointed out that there was a boutique, specially bound, limited edition copy of Stephen Saylor's Human Biodiversity book for sale at the meeting, which is like as pure a version of the return of scientific racism of the kind I'm describing here as you can find. And what they did do, anyway, through that occasion, Passage Press, who hosted it, was they created a situation where they're selling hardcore scientific racist tracts inside of the Harvard Faculty Club. So whatever else they did, they scored that victory. And I think that's a sign of, how the Overton window can be pushed through seemingly innocuous practices of debating your enemy or whatever.
Okay, so maybe we take the last two questions. You and behind. Yeah.
Thank you. Good evening. Very briefly, our colleague here asked about use of force, and you talked about it in terms of, let's say, the domestic scene in the United States and so on. But could you perhaps speak as to the international relations side of things? Because on the one hand, you have, say, the Trump administration saying that, okay, when we come in, we're going to solve Ukraine, we're going to bring peace to the Middle East, and so on and so forth. Yeah. On the other hand, very bare and unobscured imperialist language of we're going to take over Greenland, Panama Canal, etc., etc. How does this reconcile with the themes that you go through in your work? Thank you.
Should we take the other one?
Yeah, we take the last one maybe this way.
No, my question was basically the same question.
Okay.
This notion of territorial expansion.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so then we take the last one here.
First, in the meantime, I want to encourage you to go into radio. You've got an incredible radio voice. I think you could be like it. Do you do it? Are you a DJ or something? Oh, okay, you've got a very sonorous, wonderful voice. I'll also answer your question.
So we'll take the last question. Yeah.
Okay, high pressure now for my voice. I don't think
sorry.
as nice. No, my question is perhaps a bit superficial. I haven't read your book, but when I think about the populist right, I think about the fact that there are a lot of reference to communities. So like families is very important, the nation, right? We have to protect our nation. Whereas if I think about neoliberalism, I think about, an idea of individual achievement and, also a specific masculinity as well. So I was wondering, you touched upon also this idea, there was also a reference to religion, and then you briefly mentioned the idea of the expansion of the market that in a certain way goes beyond the borders. So you, in the talk, you talked upon these tensions, but I haven't really fully understood, so if you could expand a bit.
Sure, yeah. So it'll be easier, I think, if I start with yours. So I think this is why I find, whether you call it libertarianism or neoliberalism, why I find it a very interesting topic of research. Because of the very fair starting premise of your question, which is like, aren't they mostly interested in individual liberty or individual freedom? Isn't it mostly a doctrine of individualism? And yes, it is, and yes, they are. But if you follow the logical chain, then you realize that if you want to create a domain of individual freedom, then you are immediately forced to start figuring out all of the conditions in which that individual freedom will be realized. And actually, your assumption is that it won't happen in a vacuum. The idea is not someone just like wandering around, a prairie by themselves. The assumption is that how can you remain in a situation where you can draw on the many and varied products of the world. You can take advantage even of the international division of labor, and yet you can have as minimal as possible constraints put on you as an individual. You need to somehow substitute for the 20th century state in a new form so that you can have arrangements where you can have the reproduction of your form of living. You can have the ability to exchange and do business with other people, but you can't rely on the things that we all assume to be normal, the normal terms of the social contract, which is like, you probably don't wake up each morning and say like, how can I achieve more individual liberty in my life? Is it possible for me to reduce the taxation burden on me? Is it possible for me to change the site of my residence? Is it possible for me to somehow like avoid all of the demands society makes on me? They do, actually. And so when they do, they actually don't say, I therefore need to be an atomistic individual existing on Mars. I need to start beginning at a new scale of reconstructing a less burdensome form of order. So contractual communities is often how they will describe them. And in this book and the last book, I describe how conservatives and libertarians bond over that in the 1990s. They say, one thing we're unhappy about with the United States is the social state is still big. The other thing we hate, and this is also a way of answering your question, is that America still seems to want to go overseas to find new monsters to slay. And they've substituted the communist menace now with there's like this extraordinary lecture where Murray Rothbard, 1989, says, what are they doing in Washington right now, the national security heads? Well, they're probably trying to figure out who the new enemy is going to be. They're probably going to excavate someone up. Who will it be? It'll probably be Gaddafi. I bet you they'll pull Gaddafi out and say, we need to go to war over Gaddafi. And I was like, damn, you got that one. So the idea is like, if you see the state as a leviathan that's constantly extending itself overseas and sitting, burdensomely on top of you, you need to begin by dismantling it at home and then rebuilding from the smallest scale. And many, many libertarians say that one of the ways you can rebuild in ways that are less burdensome is, for one thing, you rely on the non-monetized space of social reproductive labor that women provide in a traditional community. So there you've just removed that from the equation of something that's going to be a new cost. You will do things like racial homogeneity or common culture or common religion, because then you will have fewer disputes, so you think, and you will have to settle fewer things through the problems that pluralistic societies kick up. So you start a process of micro-ordering that ends up being extremely laborious. So this is the paradox of libertarianism. They claim to want individual liberty, but their programs always involve like way more annoying laws than any one that we currently live under now. Like you have to rewrite the social contract on like blank sheets of paper, and that just is very burdensome, and also like involves relitigating things that actually modern society has long figured out. So that's the way that the right and libertarians agree on projects of the kind you describe. Like, why do we agree on dropout societies? Why do we agree on the nation even? Because they would say, well, sometimes the nation is a more functional unit for capitalism than the world, because we can have a better oversight of it. We don't have as in the case of the European Monetary Union, people from southern countries demanding things from Frankfurt or Brussels. So the unit of organization is highly variable, actually, in these debates as I read them. I'm sorry, that's a very convoluted way of answering your question, but basically that's the way of answering it, is like the meta-economic conditions that they're always so focused on always requires going beyond the individual, and it can mean culture, it can mean tradition, it can mean religion, it can mean law, and it seems to change with circumstance, as the evidence of their discussions would suggest. As to the first questions about foreign policy, so there's an interesting moment in the 1960s when the neoliberals and the neoconservatives kind of stop hanging out with each other, where basically the Congress of Cultural Freedom type Cold War liberals, Raymond Aron on the one hand and Friedrich Hayek on the other, realize that they're basically interested in two different things. And the Cold War liberals and the neoconservatives are mostly interested in like national security. And so for them, the Cold War becomes extremely important. How do we protect the West? What kind of forms of military guarantees do we need? What kind of rearmament? The whole RAND Corporation discussion, the defense establishment intellectuals who come up with ideas of mutual assured destruction and so on, game theory being played on that domain, kind of parts ways with the neoliberals who are mostly interested in economic freedom. And this is something I point out in Globalists already, which is I read a lot of Friedrich Hayek. Like I read like thousands and thousands of pages of that guy. He almost never mentions the Cold War. He's like writing from the 1930s to the 1990s, and it's like it's not even happening because it's not the main event for him. It's not the most important thing. If you're a defense intellectual, it sure is. Nuclear confrontation. If you're a neoliberal economic freedom head, then you're trying to figure out how to beat the enemy at home, produce multi-level forms of economic governance like GATT, like the WTO. And that's the direction that most things go in. So for me, the foreign policy of the Trump administration right now is like very non-neoliberal. It's not even in the lineage anywhere. Like I think the tariff policy, the totally unilateral, impulsive, unpredictable relationship to trading partners, to their own capitalist class, it's causing heads to spin amongst even his supporters, right? I mean, there's this great moment at the Milken Institute, Milken, the junk bond trader who went to prison for white-collar crimes and now is like a feted philanthropist and holds this gathering every year where the wealthiest people in America go and listen to what like the new politics should be. And they were all gathered there being like, we don't know what's, like even those of us who supported this guy, is like, what the hell is going on? And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, even came in to like calm their nerves. They're like, don't worry, there's a plan. But there's definitely no plan. So the attitude to the world trading system, I think, is just in another galaxy from these folks. Their relationship to territory, I strain to see it even in those same categories too, because the libertarian conservative model, and this hinges right into the answer to the last question, was always about decentralizing and scaling down. This idea of expanding out the territory of the United States to include Greenland and Canada and Panama Canal, hard to see in terms other than the late 19th century sort of forms of inter-imperial, competitive colonialism, much more so than I think anything from the 20th century clash of economic ideologies. One thing I think was true after 1945 is the era of empire was, if not over, it was ending. And the new puzzle of global economic governance is how do you reconcile a world of ever more politically independent nation states with a world of ever more interdependent global economic affairs. And that is the puzzle of Geneva, right? I mean, that's what the WTO has been trying to figure out for the last 35 years. And to throw that whole problem out the window and say, well, now we're just going to annex countries is like, wow, you just doing an end run around the whole problem of like modern global economic governance? Okay, I guess that was always an option. But it's hard to sort of sift through any, meeting minutes and find any intellectual scaffolding for that. It's really kind of just operating in its own domain.
On that, I think this is a great ending, and I want to thank you again very much, Quinn, for this generosity of your time. Thank you very much.